diets don't work. And they just don't. And even if you think, well, but this one did. No, it didn't. Because as Dr. Cooper said to me the first time we met, I was like, no, really. I mean, a lot of the diets worked. And she said, then why are you sitting here? And I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. You know what? They just don't. You may think, oh, yeah, I lost 50 pounds or I lost 75 pounds on this. Well, yeah, you did. But guess what? It didn't work a year later. So in the long term, no, it doesn't work. You have to think of the big picture.
Welcome to Fat Science. I'm Mark Wright, along with Andrea Taylor and Dr. Emily Cooper. It's great to see you two.
Hi there.
All right, on the show this week, centuries of evidence that diets don't work. And while you think, oh, that's inflammatory, that may not be true, it actually is true. And this week, we're going to kind of have a history lesson, Dr. Cooper, aren't we? In terms of what were the turning points in terms of our understanding of metabolism, and when did we truly start to understand that restricting calories actually doesn't work long term?
Well, looking back at everything that I could get my hands on, I could only go back so far. So I was able to find writings from the 1750s that doctors had written, and they were describing kind of their clinical experiments. These were not in medical journals, but it was just their kind of journal of how they would put patients on a certain diet. And while in the short term, the patient's weight would go down, in the long term, it went up again, and sometimes very rapidly. And so that was documented way back in the 1750s when they were mostly thinking that the low-starch diets are the big solution. So they would put people on these diets like with no starch and just meat, and they left wine in there for some reason.
A girl's got to live.
Yeah. And sometimes there was opium because it kind of helped reduce the hunger that people would experience. But even then, they were recording, they were mystified by the fact that the weight would come back, and sometimes rapidly. And so they were puzzled by that. And so way back then, it was recorded that way. But I have a feeling it might go back even further, because from some of what I've read, these kinds of diets were recommended, even not necessarily low starch diets, but various different types of diets were recommended even for high body weight conditions all the way, back in the Greek and Roman times.
I wonder why they identified carbs as the culprit, starches as the culprit, because that persists to this day.
Yeah, I think what it is someone probably kind of realized that when you cut out starches, the weight drops faster initially, because remember, what we know now is that carbohydrates are stored with water. So quite a bit of water, it kind of goes along with carbohydrates to store in our muscles, for example. And so when we cut them out, then we lose a lot of weight, but a lot of it's water weight. And so that initial weight loss can be a lot of water, especially for a large-sized person. So I think that they kind of saw that and thought, oh, this must be the key, and went further and further that direction. And then later, when they were looking at how to control diabetes, they started to cut out starches even more, and they started to cut out food even more and tried to put people on starvation diets and things like that. So it just kind of cemented in this whole low-starch thinking.
Not because it was the best food.
No.
Make them suffer.
Well, and there were actually times over the years where the medical community rebelled against the low-starch diets because they spoke out and said, these obviously are not working. And so they kind of came back with what were called the carbohydrate cures period. And that was like right around 1900, I believe. The early 1900s. And so that's when there was a brief period of time when it kind of diverged from the low starch, the typical low starch recommendations that had been going on for over 100 years, to this more carbohydrate recommendation. So they had the oat cures, the legume cures. They were different types of starches, and they were different diets based on different starches. And some of the writings from that time said that, oh, this seems like a little bit better, but still not working. So then everyone went back to the low starch after that.
So when did we actually first start being able to measure metabolism scientifically?
Yeah. Well, that's the point, because up until we could measure the metabolism, I don't think anyone really knew why the weight was coming back, and sometimes very quickly and rapidly in the long term. And then the first discovery of the fact that we do use oxygen to combust fuel and generate heat, that came in actually the 1700s, the late 1700s. Yeah, there was a scientist back then who discovered that whole thing about oxygen being used for the body to burn and combust fuel and generate heat. And they did lots of experiments back then, and that was probably the first time they could measure a metabolic response. But it took like 100 years from then to create equipment that could actually be practically used to measure this. And the equipment was still extremely expensive. So by the late 1800s, there was some equipment that was developed that could capture the metabolic story a little bit better of what was going on. But then I don't think it was really until the early 1900s that the metabolism could be measured well enough to conduct good research experiments. And so that was the next step in trying to figure out the why of all of this. So, first there was the proof that the diets don't work in the long term because the weight comes back and sometimes even more. And that was observed by people for centuries. But next, we now have a way to measure the metabolism finally, and ready for like the first experiments to measure what is going on metabolically, both before, during, and after a diet.
That's probably where the expression, she has a good metabolism, started. Scientists knew that it was metabolism, and they thought they had a way to measure it, but what was it?
Yeah. Yeah. So like up until this point, they knew that the weight would come back after these diets, and then they knew that we combust fuel, and they now finally had this equipment that could be used in a research setting to actually measure how we combust fuel to try to figure out why the weight comes back, basically. So I think a big turning point was this 1944 Minnesota starvation experiment. And that gets a lot of attention, and you can look that up. It's like a landmark study. It was the first, I think, of its kind, where the volunteers, there were lots of volunteers for the study because they were conscientious objectors to World War II. And they wanted to do their patriotic duty by offering their own body to science to go onto a calorie-restricted diet and have their metabolism measured. And part of it was because I think there was a fear that there was going to be food shortages, and the concern about what would happen to people during these food shortages and what would happen to their metabolism. So they kind of recreated that situation. And the funny thing is, so it was all males, and it was only 36 people, I think, although apparently over 1,000 people applied to be in the study. But it was a 26-week experiment where I think the first few weeks were just eating regularly. And to them, the regularly was kind of a lot of food. It was like 3,000 calories for these males. They might have been, I don't know what age they were, but probably draft age.
I was going to say draft age.
Yeah. And then after that, they reduced the calories to just under 1,600 calories a day. And that was considered like starvation, where by today's standards,
That's normal, right? For
people,
today.
yeah, that's like a nothing diet for some people
That's
today.
like lunch for some people, like us.
Yeah, or if you're going on a diet, that seems like a lot of food to a lot of people, But they followed that diet for a while, and so they measured the metabolism, the metabolic rate before the diet and at key points during the diet and following the diet after they were no longer on the diet and they were in the refeeding phase. And it was really fascinating. They were really focused on the psychological aspect of it. And boy, they really had some struggles. The men had like just a really high rate of depression and mood disorders, and they were extremely tired. And because they also had them, I think they had to walk like 20 miles a week. And they found that they were trying to they had no energy to even climb upstairs. So we were trying to avoid on the walk the stairs, and they were irritable. They started arguing. So they were doing a lot of psychological assessments too.
Like a reality show now.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And
It
that
would
was
be a
on the
Netflix show.
1600 calories.
Yeah, yeah. And and it was and they really had a hard time with every aspect of their psychological being. They did lose weight, and then they afterwards, as they were measuring their metabolic rate, they showed that their metabolism had slowed down 40% from before they started this. And it was kind of crazy because they also, at that time, they didn't have a way to measure like body composition. But what they said was during the refeeding, they put on a lot of fat. They appeared to. Now that's what they're saying, but they had no way to measure body composition. But they described a lot of fat around the abdomen and the buttocks. So that like an abnormal fat distribution is what the researchers said. So anyway, that was the first study that measured the metabolic rate going down and what's called the adaptation, the metabolic adaptation. So at that point, it was kind of clear that if your metabolic rate goes down like that, that will set you up for future abnormal weight gain potentially. And so that was the first study of that kind.
That's fascinating because it is so pervasive even to this day that just excess calories is the cause of fat.
Right. Yeah. And not
crazy.
and like just ignoring the whole biology and the whole point that we're not a two-dimensional being. I mean, we are here to adapt to our surroundings, and so of course it's just logical that our body would try to conserve energy if our energy input is limited.
So that was in the 1940s, and also in the 1940s, something happened during the Second World War that showed that this can be transferred from one generation to the next, metabolic dysfunction, right?
Yes. Yeah. And my understanding is because there's the Dutch famine, and that really led to a lot of good research where they showed that every generation was affected, even if they weren't themselves exposed to the famine. So that's that epigenetic changes in our DNA that makes us more prone to metabolic dysfunction, just because an ancestor went through, a severe famine. And I think they have proof now, at least for 3 generations, that it reverberates through
Wow,
3
that's
generations so
amazing.
far. I mean, I
So-
don't know if
So
they've
the
documented
Nazis
that.
had a food embargo in the Netherlands, right? And
Right.
so they literally starved a population, and then they followed them for what? How many years after?
I think it's 60 years. I'm pretty sure it was. But it's probably still ongoing because I think, from what I read, they're following like 3 generations. Some of those people were pregnant women at the time also. And so, and I think there've been several other famines that have been looked at and showing the same thing. And it's not just necessarily like one thing, how there's terminology, the thrifty gene that you hear, that makes you more prone to weight gain and makes it easier for your body to conserve energy. Well, that's a concept more than an actual gene. That's a concept that we have thrifty genes or thrifty DNA. So it's most likely a multitude of changes that happen metabolically that create a dysfunction that favors abnormal weight gain, a conservation of metabolism, a slowing of a metabolic rate. and maybe abnormalities that are linked to diabetes and other conditions that are metabolic.
So, could that explain why sometimes obesity runs in families?
It really could, because, how do we know what's hard coded in our DNA versus an epigenetic influence of something that happened, at an abrupt point in our heritage, our timeline, where there could have been something major like a famine or the Holocaust or, some type of situation like that could have impacted things. So I'm not sure if the scientists have a way to really tease that out unless somebody has what's called a monogenic type of obesity, where it's like a single gene responsible for their obesity, which is less common. So that would be something more that's linked into the DNA over a longer term change in DNA, not something acutely related to the environment.
Let's move forward about 50 years and let's talk about hormones and the drivers of that.
Yeah, well, up until, so we talked about how first we couldn't measure even the metabolic rate. And then with those studies that started the starvation study that looked at the metabolic rate and proved that that metabolic system is slowing down in response to this calorie restriction, we still didn't know why or how it was slowing down. Because, well, what was the actual physiologic mechanism that caused it to slow down? You could say, well, just eating less food made it slow down. But how? How did the body know to slow that down? And how did that actually happen? And so it really wasn't until the 1990s that some of these hormones started to be discovered. I mean, there was suspicion of these hormones and a lot of research leading up to the discovery of them. But leptin was one of the ones that was discovered back in the late 90s, I believe, and then also ghrelin. So remember, leptin is that body fat signal that basically represents how much fuel is stored in your body fat. And so it's supposed to broadcast that to the body so it knows at all times how much reserves you have, how much fuel reserves you have. And so leptin was discovered, and then our ability to measure it as a clinical lab test came pretty quickly after that. I mean, really, it did. I mean, I think it was within 5-6 years we could measure it, order it as a lab test after it was discovered. And ghrelin, same thing, right around that time was discovered. And another one, and ghrelin we talk about, it's got the nickname, the hunger hormone, but it's not so much that it might make you hungry, though it could. It's that it's broadcasting again to your body that your body is too hungry. And so it's a famine signal. And so that was discovered at that time. And so was adiponectin. Adiponectin is that beneficial hormone from our body fat that helps reduce the risk of diabetes. It improves our ability to respond to insulin. It reduces inflammation of our blood vessels. It's an important one. It also increases our muscle metabolism. So at that point, like hormones like that were started to, we could not only know about them, but we could start measuring them clinically pretty soon after that. And, following that, GLP-1 and the GIP and all of the gut hormones. So tons of hormones started to be identified clearly and eventually being able to be measured. So now we were at the forefront of, we have enough ability to measure these things. Maybe these are the drivers of why the metabolism or how the metabolism is slowing down to conserve energy with the different calorie restriction. And so at that point, that was also another milestone, another break point.
And it's been subsequently shown that when you diet, your leptin levels drop pretty rapidly once you start dieting, right?
Yes, that was the next thing that happened was probably, I think the first really good, there were several short-term studies that were identifying that, pretty quickly. In between the year 2000 and 2010, there were lots of studies that came out showing that calorie restriction caused a drop in leptin, an increase in ghrelin, and again, just an imbalance favoring fat regain because basically weakening the security signals, strengthening the famine signals. So those studies were done, but they were very short term. And what was crazy is these changes happen really fast within a week of a diet. So,
that
yeah.
fast.
And so that's why they were doing these short term studies because you could see it right away. But I think one thing that was a real breakthrough was in 2011, there's a study, the researcher is Sumithran, and he did a really great breakthrough study, I feel, because it was the first long-term study. So in that study, they measured all of those, and it's amazing how many they measured. They measured GLP-1, PYY, they measured leptin, ghrelin, cholecystokinin. There's a whole bunch that they did measure, almost everything you would want to know about. And they measured the metabolism too. But mostly they were looking at these hormones and how they could be the biologic drivers of the metabolic adaptation, the energy conservation, and why our metabolism slows down or how it slows down by variances that occur in these hormones when we go on calorie restrictive diets. And so they put people on a 10-week diet, and the subjects were in the quote overweight obesity category. But this was just an isolated diet. They weren't necessarily dieters before this. They measured their baseline numbers, and then they measured, I believe, into the diet, they measured maybe at some intervals, but for sure right after the diet, and then again a year later. So now this is a 62-week study, and it was kind of amazing, really, to see that because it really confirmed the suspicions of how our metabolism slows down from calorie restriction and the importance of these metabolic hormones, and how they keep our metabolism strong. Because what happened during the calorie restriction period was every one of the beneficial hormones that are the security signals dropped significantly. And every one of the famine signals that block our metabolism increased. So right away, just even in the post-diet period. But then what was really alarming is a year later when they checked again, they hadn't returned to baseline, and some of them actually had gotten worse. Some of them had gotten worse, and none of them had really improved.
So
So-
a year later,
A year
a
later.
year later, there's the damage that was done to slowing the metabolism was still showing effects
It was
a
still
year
there.
later.
Yeah, it's like it left an imprint, and they said it could be permanent. They don't know because it still had not returned, but that was the study. And that
So-
was the longest one at the time.
Hormonally, that explains what you refer to as diet damage, right?
Yeah. Yep, that does hormonally. Absolutely.
And then most people, like let's say that happened to you, or to me, I would probably, probably 6 months in, go on another diet. So
Yeah.
then you would have effect on effect on effect on effect on effect,
Yes.
building up, building up, building up. So you have diet damage on diet damage on diet damage on diet damage.
That's a good point because that's probably what would happen because with these changes metabolically and the slowing of the metabolism that occurs, the weight will be coming back on
Right.
and more so than it did before you went on that first diet.
Yeah.
So what are people going to do? Like you said, Andrea.
Do it again. Because if you don't fail once, fail again.
So when we first come to you as patients, Dr. Cooper, leptin is something that you really take a close look at. When you get those leptin levels back up to adequate, what happens to the brain and what happens to the metabolism in terms of burning calories?
Well, I wish it was that simple, but if you never were on a diet and you just have a normal system, your leptin will be at a certain level that should reflect your actual body fat stores so that it's broadcasting the right information. Your brain would receive the signal correctly, your rest of your body would, and everything's fine. But once you do the dieting, another thing that happens that we've talked about is ghrelin can go up. Ghrelin, that hunger hormone. And ghrelin blocks the receptors in the brain that are trying to sense the leptin signal. So even when you get the leptin back to normal, it may or may not improve the picture because if you still have high ghrelin and it's blocking that signal, it may be still hard for the brain to see the leptin But hopefully, but we still aim for that. We still want the leptin to be accurately reflecting the body weight. So the key areas there, in addition to not being on a diet, the key areas are also sleep is very important for leptin too. But, it takes a long time. It takes no time at all for the leptin to drop on a calorie restricted diet. And then it takes a long time for it to come back. Same thing. We talk about this marker, agouti-related peptide, AGRP, which is in the hypothalamus. It's like probably the most potent orexogen, which means famine signal, that we can measure, we know about in the brain. And that one, it's very easy for it to increase. It can just exponentially increase so fast with calorie restriction. But for it to come back to normal, it just can take years. And so if it does come back, so that's why I've been having our clinic is helpful, because there is no long-term research data. All we have is that Sumithrin, which was that, his study, which did go a year after that 10-week diet. And the only other one really is the Biggest Loser study that would be long-term, where they took the contestants of the Biggest Loser, and they did show that after the contest, their metabolisms were like 600 calories slower. Some of it accounted for by the reduction of their body weight, because when you weigh less, your metabolism would be slower naturally. But a lot of it wasn't accounted for by that. It was from the metabolic adaptation. And then when they looked at them 6 years later, it was even slower, their metabolism. So that's the only other insight that's there, is that longer term look. But we, as I said, I'm not trying to say anything about, our practice and advertise that at all. But what I'm trying to say is that we felt the need to measure these things and record them over time. And as you know, some of the people even who've come on the podcast have been patients for, more than a decade. And so when you have that kind of clinical data, you really get a sense of how long it takes for these things to come back potentially, and how many variances there are from person to person. And for a lot of people, it just takes a really long time if it does come back. Some people, we don't see it really return back to normal necessarily. So those would be people who might be more dependent on longer term medication to help regulate things. But again, we don't know if that's the only reason, their diet was the only reason that we're seeing these imbalances, because these aren't being studied lifelong. But it's certainly important. It's certainly an important piece of it. And so I think it's something that's overlooked and understated, underplayed.
And it almost seems like to truly measure some of this stuff, you'd have to put people's health in danger, which is just not something that we can do. And it also, to provide a sort of a closed environment costs a lot of money, doesn't it, Dr. Cooper, in terms of, restricting what people actually eat and in a very controlled environment. What do you think's missing in the research at this point? I think it's fascinating that these key hormones weren't identified until the 1990s.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like yesterday from a science standpoint.
Yeah, and we know so much about them now already.
Yeah, but what do you think's missing in the research that would help at this point?
Well, I think that these studies that keep saying the same thing, for some reason, they're not getting enough attention. And instead, the short-term studies that are showing the good results of diets are getting tons of front page news and tons of attention. And I don't think people are realizing that, yes, we already knew that diets can force your body to lose weight in that short term. We've already known that. But there's a window there where that's, working. And what we've been ignoring are the long-term consequences. And we're not measuring anything beyond that short term. And part of that is because of research funding and research design and, grad students being involved in a lot of the research, that it's good that they are, but they may be replicating similar studies that have always been done. To do one that Sumithrin did, where they went back a year later. So it wasn't that they were putting those people at risk. There was no risk because they'd already gone on this diet. And they did a really great job of collecting all the baseline data. So I think when you're doing research, if we can at least collect enough baseline data, that in the future, if there's funding available, we could go back and remeasure some of these things. And so I think that would be a big help. But I also think that in clinical medicine, we ideally would be looking more at these markers too in our own patients and just trying to understand more like where their initial baseline is and through treatment processes, where they are. Because I find it is motivating to patients to try to point out, well, look at where we are. And in order to get this leptin level up, we do need you to be sleeping a certain amount. We need you to be eating regularly. We need you to fuel the exercise. If they didn't see where their numbers are, maybe it wouldn't have as much meaning. So I think just from a therapeutic standpoint, we're underutilizing that too. But I think we have the research, Mark. I don't think that's a lack of research. And I think that's why sometimes when I speak about it, I'm just very like, yeah, of course, there's metabolic adaptation, and of course diets don't work. And people are just kind of like, where is she coming from? But because in my mind, that's already established in the science, in literature. It's been there for so long. That's established. We're not really impressed with the short-term results that diets produce. In fact, that kind of makes me nervous when people say, oh, this diet's working and I lost X amount of weight in just like 6 weeks. And then I'm thinking, oh boy, this metabolic adaptation is going to come and they're going to be like in some kind of crazy weight gain mode. So I feel unsettled when I hear that. But it's not, I don't feel that I'm biased because the way that I, learned about this is I was working with patients and the patients were experiencing these things. And I was trying to find out why. And then when I started looking at why are my patients experiencing these things, that's where I found the research was there. And that's the research that told me why. And then it made complete sense. And so it's not that I was only looking for research that backs that up. It's that I'm trying to find out why these things are happening to actual patients I see on a daily basis. And in doing that is how I discovered that there's this whole body of science that has been repeated again and again and is very convincing that these biologic drivers are so important and that calorie restriction can weaken our metabolism. And so that's why I think it was starting, I'm trying to think when, it's at least, I was measuring that leptin in 2005. And so even before that, I knew that the calorie restriction wasn't right for my patients. And so in all these years, now we've got like more than 20 years of never allowing our patients to do the calorie restriction modalities and to always fuel the exercise and to focus more on metabolism and nutrition and fueling. And the results are so good across the board. I mean, yes, not every patient is going to be easy, to respond, but the vast majority and the data that we have really backs that up as a solid approach.
Well, I could tell you from just my friend set and people I know, I could tell you that the diets don't work because you look around and it's like every single person that yes, you do lose weight on a low carb diet or a whatever, smoothie diet or whatever thing you're doing. You'll lose weight instantly or, in the first 6 weeks, but talk to me a year later. Talk to me when you're on your next one. Talk to me when you're plateauing or whatever. It's obvious. It's obvious. And, we live in a culture where it's like, it's almost like, oh my God, it's like we're on repeat. Wash, rinse, repeat. Like, it's always happening. And it's like, I don't want to have this conversation. Like, I feel like with a lot of my friends, it's like, I don't want to have this conversation with you again. Like, ever since we've, done our thing, I feel like I'm on repeat all the time. I'm like, you need to stop. This is a vicious cycle. And why are you doing this to yourself over and over and over again? You're just beating yourself up. It's the most negative thing. I'm telling you, like, you could be free.
Dr. Cooper, they've found that GLP-1 levels and GIP levels drop during dieting too, right? And this new, I mean, it's not super new, but this resurgence of drugs now, like Ozempic and Mounjaro, and they're stepping in and having a profound impact in those patients. But at the same time, we're now also seeing doctors prescribing GLP-1s
With a
and
diet.
calorie restriction at the same time too, right?
Terrible.
Yeah, it's another thing that makes no sense. So if you look at it, it's like over the years we've known the diets don't work beyond short term. And yet patients are put on diets by medical professionals without being given what we call informed consent, which you have to do for certain medical procedures. I feel like the doctor should have to have a discussion with the patient before recommending them to go on a diet, a calorie restricted diet, and to say to them, I will prescribe you this diet, and in the short term, you probably will lose X amount of weight, but then that will be followed by a plateau and a weight regain in which you could end up at 22% higher weight. And the increase in your weight after you have lost the weight, once you start gaining the weight, some of that weight is going to end up in your visceral organs where it isn't there now. Do you want to do this diet? To me, I don't know why they don't say that, and so that I don't, and so that's my thing is the do no harm part of the medical care that led me to stop recommending any diets, even back in like 2000, I knew that they weren't working. And so between 2000 and 2005, I was trying to figure out why this was happening and what is the answer. And so I was so happy to find, this explanation, scientific explanation for what's really going on. But I was also like shocked that it wasn't getting attention even back then. And to think now it's not. And so I think and doctors always just poo-poo this whole metabolic adaptation. They all have excuses for why it's not really real or why you don't have to worry about it. But they're the first ones to tell patients, you're underreporting your exercise, you're underreporting your food intake, you're underreport your whatever,
Underreporting their food,
Thank you.
overreporting your exercise.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. I mean, that they're the first ones to accuse patients of that. And it's like, instead of paying attention to the metabolic adaptation studies, and a lot of the things that they refer to as showing that it's not a big problem are these very short-term things. And so again, you have to look at the big picture. And so I just really think that people need to make their own decisions, obviously. But some of making our own decisions is looking at our life, and what our life experiences are. And so I think some people know from just their personal life experiences what's the right path and what's not the right path. And then hopefully getting to a point where we can dismantle that whole diet mentality, diet culture would be great. But you have to realize, again, the diet industry is making a fortune on this. And so is the online weight loss industry. They're making a fortune on pushing the fact that it's a patient's fault that this is happening to them, that they're just not eating the right way. They're not exercising the right way. Yes, they'll give them this medicine, but they've got to also do this diet and this exercise plan. And as long as there's that much money in it, it's going to be hard to undo. I even read something the other day that some insurance companies were going to start requiring that patients have to see a dietitian if they're going to approve a GLP-1 med for obesity. And to me, that is so discriminatory. I mean, yes, if a doctor has a patient and they both decide that that patient would benefit from seeing a dietitian for whatever reasons, fine. Just like if they have a patient with heart disease or hypertension or diabetes or cancer, and they think that patient needs to, would benefit from seeing a dietitian, fine. But why, isolate this specific group of people with a specific diagnosis of obesity and say they all need to see a dietitian? I mean, you're basically saying that you have obesity because you're not controlling your food intake, and you need a dietitian to help you know how you're supposed to be eating on a calorie restricted diet. That's what they're talking about. And to me, any doctor that endorses that is showing their weight bias, because that's just not okay, to single out that group. And so, but that goes back to our mentality that in spite of all this research looking at us in the face, in spite of all these like amazing hormones and amazing science of metabolism, we're telling people that they should just go and stop eating as much and exercise. And that's, that it's their fault that this is happening. That's not, it's just not recognizing that it's a biological condition.
I'm wondering how much of this is taught in medical schools today, Dr. Cooper. Do we know?
Well, I don't know, because I know that I've worked with some students, who've come through, or med students or students even in residency programs, and it wasn't being taught at all. And that wasn't that long ago that I last encountered that, even at major universities. But I think they're starting to at least talk about these hormones. So maybe that'll spark the interest of people. But
It just seems like there's a huge disconnect, because when we've talked about the fact that half of the population here is diabetic or pre-diabetic, obesity is an epidemic, that it just seems only logical that they should be focusing a ton of the instruction in medical school on the science of this.
They should. And the disheartening thing is that I think a new study came out showing that 70% of medical professionals have weight bias and are tend to be in that category. And so that would make them resistant to hearing about the biologic causes of obesity. So we have a long way to go, but you know what? That's why we're doing this podcast. And I mean, that's why I started the nonprofit, the Diabetes Institute, because when I started seeing all this, I was like, wow, we got to try to get this information out there, because it's amazing information and nobody's talking about it. So that's also behind why we're doing the podcast too.
Wow. I was talking to a friend yesterday. He said, I'm struggling with fatty liver. And I said, wow, we just did an episode not too long ago on fatty liver. And he said, yeah, and my doctor just said I'm just now pre-diabetic. And I'm like, are you on any sort of GLP-1? He goes, no, I'm not on anything right now. And I'm thinking, wow, it just, yeah. I mean,
well, I think it's more also attitude. What we need is more preventive medicine providers that are focused on preventive medicine, because when you're trying to prevent diseases, you kind of act like things like that are an emergency. You think you see them, you view them as an emergency, even though maybe that person won't have diabetes for another 5 years. It's an emergency today to reverse it if you're trying to prevent disease. And so I think that's different than maybe from another viewpoint. They'd say, well, you don't have diabetes, so you're okay for now. We'll check it in a year.
Right.
wow.
Yeah.
Do you think Dr. Cooper will look back as a society 50, 100 years from now and say, oh my goodness, what were they thinking?
I hope so, but part of me, I don't think so.
Because, well, we've talked, this debate has been going on for centuries, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, as long as there's the weight bias, which is hard to undo, and the body image issues, especially in our country and maybe some other countries, I don't know. I mean, this stuff has been going on so long, and the crazy things people have done over the years to market weight loss and all that. As long as there's money in it, it's just gonna just keep going. And as long as somebody feels like righteous to shame someone else over things, I think it's gonna keep going. But I mean, hopefully it will. Hopefully with our younger generation, maybe getting access to treatment earlier, maybe they'll grow up and kind of help shape the conversations.
Yeah, human bias has really reared its ugly head. In my professional career as a journalist, there was a period that insurance companies didn't consider mental illness something that they should cover
Yep.
in our lifetimes.
I know.
So when you think about the shaming when it comes to addiction, the shaming when it comes to fat, the bias when it comes to mental illness, humans are funny
Substance
that way.
use. Yep.
Yeah.
Right.
There's so much. Yep.
And especially, I was watching an old movie that I used to love. This movie is Tommy Boy with
Oh,
oh gosh, I can't remember the names of the characters, David Spade and Chris Farley. There were so many inappropriate fat shaming jokes in that movie. When now it's several,
well, that was Chris Farley's whole thing.
yeah, his whole thing. And, it's kind of like Arthur back in the day when alcoholism was something funny to joke about. And it was funny to joke about people who were overweight. We've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you, anything that you want to leave us with, Dr. Cooper? Maybe first start with Andrea. What's your reaction to all this, Andrea?
I would just say diets don't work. And they just don't. And even if you think, well, but this one did, no, it didn't. Because as Dr. Cooper said to me the first time we met, I was like, no, really, I mean, a lot of the diets worked. And she said, then why are you sitting here? And I was like, oh, yeah, you're right. You know what? They just don't. You may think, oh, yeah, I lost 50 pounds or I lost 75 pounds on this. Well, yeah, you did. But guess what? It didn't work a year later. So in the long term, no, it doesn't work. You have to think of the big picture. And you also have to think about health. And you have to think, like you just said, about your mental well-being. And that's really important. So in the big picture, diets don't work.
I love it. And I guess the takeaway for me, Dr. Cooper, is that, the old saying, you are what you eat, really is the truth. Like, if we put good stuff in our bodies, good things happen. But we have to also realize that we need constant fueling. Otherwise, our brain says, what's going on? We're a little bit worried up here. Where's the food? And it just seems like that idea of food security is so important to this whole conversation. What's your final take, Dr. Cooper?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a big, proponent of letting people do what they want to do. Of course, if that's something somebody wants to do, go ahead. But where I don't like it is, say you do something and it just doesn't help solve the problem. That's one thing. But if it also can cause damage and harm, that takes it to a different level. And so that's how I see diets, these calorie restricted diets. I see them not just that they don't work, but the harm and damage that they do on so many levels, makes them just not safe, not good to follow, and not good to prescribe for medical professionals. And so that doesn't mean that nutrition is not an important component of our health. It is. We're not saying that we don't value nutrition. Nutrition is such an important component of every single medical condition, every single health-related thing. But that doesn't mean restricting calories, cutting out food groups, starving yourself, exercising without fuel is in that category. It's not. So anyway, so I just encourage people to kind of advocate for themselves if they're being recommended to go on any kind of calorie restriction or carb restriction, to think through what works for you. If you really want to do that, that's fine. But always keep in mind that there's that risk of the metabolic adaptation and then what can follow.
Yeah.
And that things can be more difficult to control later because of following these short-term diets. And remember, the weight cycling, which is repeating diets over and over, that is associated with increased cardiovascular risk, increased visceral fat risk. So there are definite harms that can come from that.
Yeah. I love how you said do no harm, because if your doctor's telling you to cut calories and to exercise more, especially at the same time, it's not, you're right. It's not just the risk of gaining weight. It's the risk of permanent damage to your health. So do no harm.
Right.
Love your metabolism.
That's right.
All right. Thanks, you two.
This
has been another edition of Fat Science.
No diets, no agendas.
There we
Just
go.
science that makes you feel better.